say we don't believe in magic is not that we don't believe in God. It's on the contrary, we don't believe that there's some kind of automatic way by doing a certain ritual. If I want to get rid of you, I make a little image and put a pin in it. When we relate to God, that's not, well, we sometimes ask God, help me to pass the exams. And that kind of prayer, I think, is a very important part of spiritual life. But the real point is getting close to God, and we become finer, better, fuller people in doing this. But I mean, if that's magic, then any kind of moral growth is magic. And of course, if you use the word that sloppily, then all distinctions go. But if you see very clearly what the narrow meaning of disenchantment, then clearly that doesn't touch a whole lot of religions in the world that are not based. Is the message of the Buddha based on magic? Is clearly not.
Right. I mean,
Charles is absolutely right, and and that's, I think, why we both engage in philosophy as our immune system against what Wittgenstein called the bewitchment of intelligence by means of language. The truth is that the Torah in Parashat Shoftim, in the middle of Deuteronomy, absolutely forbids magic of all kinds. Consulting the dead, soothsaying, and all this kind of thing, and absolutely opposed to it. Secondly, the Hebrew word for to pray, lehitpalel, actually means to judge yourself. And actually prayer has more to do with openness to otherness than some magical way of bringing about a certain result. And as the old joke puts it, Goldberg, who's been faithfully to synagogue every day for 50 years, suddenly doesn't turn up for several weeks, and the rabbi goes to see him and he says, "Goldberg, what's the matter? You always came to synagogue. You always prayed." He said, "For 50 years I prayed, and once in my life I asked God one thing. I said, God, let me win the lottery. I need 50 million pounds. And he didn't answer my prayer, so I'm not going to pray anymore." And the rabbi said, "Goldberg, God did answer your prayer. It's just that the answer was no." I believe we are transformed by prayer in a way that Iris Murdoch said so beautifully. I mentioned this to Charles earlier in NYU a couple of days ago. Iris Murdoch has this wonderful passage in her book, The Sovereignty of Good, where she's talking about someone, you're in a state, you're feeling very low, very sorry for yourself, and you look out of the window, and suddenly your attention is caught by a kestrel, and you're absolutely entranced by the beauty and power of this bird. And all of a sudden you forget yourself completely. Me becomes nothing, and it's all kestrel. And Iris Murdoch called this unselfing. And that was part of her theory, of sort of Platonic theory of good as a way of, unselfing and seeing what's really there. And there's no doubt that I responded to that, resonated to that as a Jew, because actually I think that is what prayer is. It is a sustained act of unselfing, and our daily prayers begin with this long list of blessings to God for giving us back our life today, for the air we breathe, for the ground we tread on, and so on, all of which is opening our eyes to wonder. And I think that's the power of prayer, and it's got nothing to do with magic.
But there was, in the pews or in the general life of the synagogue, lots of people who were doing lots of things on the side, even though they weren't entirely considered kosher, which we can think of in terms of the world of magic. That was certainly the case of medieval Christianity. I mean, there was all this fear of the spirits of the woods and beating the bounds of the parish, and that was an important part of parish life. So we're in a new epoch in which, if you like, religion, which was rather closely linked with magic in many cases, is being detached from it. But what this is not a totally new situation. It's liberating a possibility that was formerly perhaps more a minority than a majority choice, and making it the center of our religious lives. I think that is the, if you like, spectacular change, if you look over the 500 years that's come.
There is a legal principle in Judaism, ein somchin al hanes. We do not rely on miracles. We're making calculations. Those must be done on a rational base. But the locus classicus here is Isaiah chapter 1, so we're going back to 7th, 8th century before the Christian era. That powerful vision of chapter 1 in which God says, you know, if you fail to execute social justice and care for the widow and the orphan, and you take bribes as a politician, all the rest of it, God says, who asked you to come trampling on my courts? The more you pray, the less I will listen. In other words, Isaiah was saying, don't believe you can see prayer as some magical way of achieving a result. A successful society is one built on perfectly rational, ethical principles. And God is not your shortcut that allows you to bypass the ethical and hence also in that broad sense the rational.
Related to this, I wanted to bring a quote from Peter Berger when he writes in A Far Glory, which is a book he published about 20 years ago. And I remember when I first read it, it really struck me, even though he was talking about the Protestant experience. He says that he believes there's a kind of surrender, that's the word he uses, that takes place on the part of many contemporary Christian theologians, and it could apply to Judaism as well. And what he talks about is when certain things are substituted for traditional religion. The substitutes, he says, are things like the alleged ethics of Jesus, or some sort of existential experience, or mental health with a spiritual component, or Christianity as a political agenda. And all of these he sees as substitutions, and hence he sees them as a kind of suicide. In other words, when religion is used to do the things that other domains can do, that people can discover that they can do all of these things without religion. They can be ethical without Jesus, and they can be existentially authentic and healthy without religion, etc. So he seems to be arguing that the people who communicate religion today, perhaps except in the most orthodox circles, feel that the message of traditional religion, that's why I was interested, Chief Rabbi, when you were talking about opening oneself, that there seems to be a replacement of the old words, God, sacrifice, obligation, sin, reward, punishment. And in fact, in many places in the Jewish world, and I assume it's this way in the Christian world as well, there's a new kind of language. Religion as self-growth, or meditative practice, or what you speak about in your book, authenticity. So I'm wondering if you think that the way we talk about religion today reflects, you said it was liberating, but I'm wondering if it's also a certain defensiveness. As though religion is a bit embarrassed about the old words. And so to engage people in the modern world, we try and open up religion's potential in a spiritual sense, which is a good thing. But I'm wondering if it's also an avoidance of the old stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you have here in these various things that you mentioned, like self-growth and so on, is an abandonment of what, in both Judaism and Christianity, you could mention Buddhism, you could mention many other religions, is the possibility of a much profounder change in human beings. I mean, let's speak in terms of our two religions here, though we'd have to phrase it differently if we're speaking of others, but that in contact with God, one can have a much profounder transformation, which can't be captured by things like self-growth, because one of the things that's involved is unselfing, is going beyond the self, right? And so it's possible to react to the modern world by saying, well, those kinds of more far-reaching transformations, forget them. We can have a perfectly happy life down here with these much lesser modes, which we can calculate in different ways of, this kind of particular kind of meditation will make you happier and so on, right? And that's certainly a very important trend in the modern world. And sometimes religious communities can, in a little certain way, cave into that trend. But it can't really suffice in the end, because for some people it might, but for many, many people, the sense that there's something more brings them back again to the Bible.
Is it a shrinking? Are we shrinking religion a little bit?
It's a sellout, an absolute sellout. I mean, religion is more than canonizing the status quo. Yeah. And, really, in fact, it's a kind of idolatry. Idolatry means making God in our image instead of allowing him to remake us in his. And it always struck me as a pretty ridiculous strategy. You know those early Woody Allen films, neurotic Jewish Brooklyn kid meets suave, sophisticated white Anglo-Saxon Protestant girlfriend. I can't remember whether this was the Diane Keaton phase or the other phase, whatever it was. And they're kind of talking, and he's saying to her, what was the biggest sin when you were a child, And she says something like, whatever it is, speaking while you're eating or something. And she says to him, and what was the biggest sin when you were a child? And he says, buying retail. Jews cut out the middleman. So if the synagogue delivers for me something that the secular society delivers cleaner and better, I'm going to cut out the middleman and go straight to the secular society. So don't try and do that with Jews. I remember for the last 10 years or 15 years, I've launched something. It's a mainly Christian thing, but it's a lot of charities, some secular, called National Marriage Week. And the first time we did this in Britain, marriage is a pretty bad state. 46% of children in Britain now are born outside of marriage. So marriage is really in disarray. And so when I opened this National Marriage Week for the first time, a journalist came up to me and said, "Isn't that terribly politically incorrect, Chief Rabbi?" I said, "Of course it is! If it weren't, what would be the point of our saying it?" Religion is there as a counter voice. It is a challenge to the norms of society, and it's a way of saying, look up, search for a more expansive horizon. Now, we are living in the big I generation of all time. Our new revelation was brought down the mountain by the late Steve Jobs, holding in his hand the two tablets, iPad 1 and iPad 2. And so we have the iPad, the iPhone, the iPod, the iTunes, everything's I. And it is not surprising that we are more affluent than previous generations and more prone to depressive and stress-related syndromes. And religion is about moving beyond the I call religion the redemption of solitude. And that is a direct challenge to the individualism of contemporary